is where you work, right?
Yes.
Now your mic is working. Yeah.
I think that's yours. I have mine here.
Ale oni będzie to...
Have you done the book?
I'm sorry?
Have you done
No,
the book?
but I will, it's there. I got it.
And then I'm going back to
Okay, but you had 2-3 days on the ground, right?
wonderful day.
Okay.
Wonderful day, I must say.
Okay.
Celebrating with old friends.
Yeah,
That's great.
that's lovely.
Really, really. 'Cause, we didn't expect it.
Okay, to chyba będziemy... We will start in a second. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, here in Warsaw at the premises of Polityka. And at the screens, I would like to welcome all of you very warmly on behalf of the European Council on Foreign Relations and Polityka Insight. We have the great pleasure to organize this Warsaw Election Conversation at a very particular moment of time, I think, for Polish and European history. Just 3 days after the election, which took place on Sunday, and many of you are, or all of you are certainly aware of the results. We will just in a second start trying to make sense of what they mean for Europe and for Poland. But let me first tell you that this Warsaw Election Conversation is part of a joint project of ECFR and Polityka Insight, which is called Warsaw European Conversation, a major conference on European affairs, which we first launched in May this year, and the second edition will take place next year. I would like to invite all of you to follow the preparations for this event and to participate in it next year. But more importantly, I would like to welcome our great panel. With us are Daniela Schwarzer, who is a member of the executive board of the Bertelsmann Foundation, but not less importantly, she's also a leading European analyst on European and international affairs, author of numerous publications, books, and most recently a Krisenzeit, just published in German, a book on the challenges Germany and Europe are facing today. And Daniela is also member of the, which is not unimportant in the context of our conversation, is member of the Franco-German expert group on the future of Europe and co-author of a paper which was recently published of this group and widely commented in international media. Then we have Timothy Garton-Ash, whom I really don't need to introduce, especially in Warsaw. He's been with us in Poland for 40 years, at least. And Timothy Garton-Ash is a historian and professor at the Oxford University and also author of numerous books, most recently Homeland, his private account of the history of the last 30 years, or actually more. And last but not least, I would like to welcome Andrzej Bobiński, who is actually co-host of this event as the executive managing director of Polityka Insight and host of the, I dare to say, the best Polish Polityka podcast, Nasłuch, and who will try to explain to us the complexities of the political situation in Poland after this election. But before I give the floor to Andrzej, I would like to start with Timothy, and I already mentioned that he has been with us here in Poland and witnessed the developments of the Polish politics for 4 decades. And I would like to ask you, Timothy, about your first impression of this after this election. The Democrats won, the populists were defeated. Donald Tusk, at one of the election rallies, used this comparison with Solidarność, saying that this new mobilization of the Polish society is the third wave of Solidarność. And you witnessed Solidarność 1980, 1989, and the developments later. Do you agree with this comparison, and do you agree with this metaphor? How do you see the election result in this broader or deeper historical perspective?
Well, thank you, Piotr. It's wonderful to be here, and particularly in these days. I, as one or two of you who read my Guardian column will know, I went to vote on Sunday with my very old friends, with whom I also went to vote on the 4th of June, 1989. But when I say went to vote, I don't mean I actually voted. I mean went to the polling station with them. And so I was thinking about the comparison. I mean, similarities, people forget this. We didn't know what the result was going to be. People now think it was kind of inevitable that it would happen in 1989, but it was as much of a surprise then as it was now. So there was the same nervous anticipation. Similarity, neither of these elections were properly free and fair, as you would expect in an exemplar democracy. Then it was explicitly semi-free, because seats in the same were reserved for the communist authorities. Now, as most of you know, it was a more subtle kind of unfairness with, state-controlled media being part of a massive propaganda campaign for the ruling party, and the referendum being held on the same day, which is in a way a part of the ruling party election propaganda, and so on and so forth. But neither of them were properly full and free election. But in both cases, it turns out that you can win an unfair election if you have sufficient self-organization and mobilization. So those are the similarities. Now, here's a couple of the differences. Number one, that time, I went with my old friends and their 7-year-old daughter to the polls. This time, the 7-year-old daughter came with us because she's now 40 or 41, and herself has a 7-year-old daughter. And the conversation on the way to the polling station was about what would happen if peace won again to the education system. What would happen to the education of this 7-year-old if you had this mendacious nationalistic version of history being pumped at them in the school system? So whereas in '89 it was sort of a lot of hope as well as uncertainty, here it was fear as well as uncertainty. That was the dominant emotion. And that brings me to the final point in this comparison, which is '89, the election opened the door to something totally new. The door to democracy, the, quote, return to Europe, the whole process that ended with Poland joining the EU. Here, it was about reverting, getting back to something that had already been achieved. So you actually had a liberal democracy, which was a member of NATO and the EU, which was being turned into an illiberal democracy, which had marginalized itself in the EU. So it was a very different feel to it. It was about getting back to something that had already been achieved rather than some unknown but rather hopeful future. Last comment. That's why, although I can understand why Donald Tusk likes to make that comparison, I don't think this is necessarily a very helpful framing. If you suggest that, it's all about huge demonstrations which were like those I witnessed in the 1980s, and it's us and them, there's this alien power which has to be got rid of, that's not a good framing for a democracy. 1 in 3 people who voted for peace, and they did it for lots of good reasons, or their own reasons. And so I don't think that kind of heroic Manichaean framing of me and Oni, us and them, is necessarily very hopeful going forward.
Yeah, thank you very much, Timothy. I think we will come back to this point, but before we do that, Andrzej, let us, dive a little bit deeper into the analysis of the results of this vote. Before the vote, most observers actually, including I think us, predicted rather a hung parliament, or believed that the third term of peace was the most likely scenario. So how do you explain the ultimate result of this vote, and what were, in your opinion, the main factors which made the success of the Democrats possible, and what does it tell us basically about the state of mind of the Polish society?
Thank you, Piotr. There's an easy answer and an easy explanation, and it's one word, it's turnout. And then it gets more difficult. But basically, what nobody knew, what nobody expected, was that 74% of the Poles would go to the polls. And that was amazing, and it's a huge success of civil society in this country, regardless of who you're rooting for and who you voted for. Now, why was that? Why did these people go out and vote? Why did they surprise us and also the party leaders? Well, one thing quite obviously is there was a very strong anti-government sentiment in society, and this was a vote against the government. And this was for a number of reasons. One, because there was this feeling that this is a huge threat to democracy and that a third peace term would probably turn us off the path of liberal democracy. Two, there were various views on how COVID was handled, but basically this was not a success story for the government. Next, the economic situation and especially inflation was a big problem for peace. Then the draconian abortion law, we all remember those protests a couple of years ago, which also mobilized the younger electorate and also younger women. And finally, an unprecedented number of scandals, which we thought would not harm peace the way it did, but I think even though they were swept under the carpet, they were still there, and you could still feel them in the air. So I think these were things that did impact the anti-government vote. Why were we wrong? Why did we think that it wouldn't go that easy, that smoothly? I think that basically there's this feeling and this belief that Jarosław Kaczyński is an evil genius. I don't think he's all that evil, and I don't think he's that much of a genius, actually. On the one hand, I think we're going to see a smooth transition of power, and I think many people didn't believe in that, and I think that's exactly what's going to happen. I think that at the end of the day, even though I agree, obviously, that this was not a free and fair election, and even though I agree that we were not living in a liberal democracy, we were still living in a democracy, and the people voted, and power will change hands. Two, I think Jarosław Kaczyński and his acolytes overplayed their hand, and I think that this uneven playing field didn't necessarily work to their advantage. And a good example of that is, I think, the referendum. There was this bizarre referendum where people were supposed to vote no for issues. I think that at the end of the day, the referendum worked against peace, against Jarosław Kaczyński, because it made people aware of the fact that something is wrong, that these are not normal rules in a normal democracy, and this really mobilized voters. And I think that at the end of the day, it demobilized peace voters, soft peace voters, if there were any left after these 8 years. So finally, I think that it's difficult to understand and imagine change, and that's why I think many people thought that this wouldn't happen, especially after Turkey, especially after Hungary, but also after Slovakia. I think there was this feeling that basically, and we'd read all these books, and we had this feeling that liberal democracies were in a huge crisis, and that the strongmen and the populists were taking over. And I think we underestimated the voice of protest. But having said all that, I just want to say that this huge turnout wasn't only caused by the fact that it was the anti-government voters that went out to vote. it was also caused by the fact that a lot of people voted for peace, and peace got a better result at the end of the day if you look at, not at the percentages, but at the real numbers of the amount of voters who voted for peace. So I wouldn't underestimate that either. I mean, this story isn't only about a civil society overthrowing a tyrant. It's about something else. I think it's about a very important moment in our history which could go either way.
Before we come to our main part of discussion about the implications for Europe, let me ask you, Andrzej, again, and look a little bit into the future, because we are, I think, at the very beginning of the Polish Zeitenwende, if I may put it so. And as we speak, the political leaders are meeting and preparing ground for the government formation. So very briefly, two questions. What will happen next, and how smoothly this transition will go? And what are, in your opinion, the main chances and the main risks on the road ahead?
Well, I'm fairly certain, and I hope I won't be wrong, that the transition will be smooth, but it's not going to be very fast. So basically, President Andrzej Duda and PiS will take all the time they have, and that's been allocated to them by the Polish constitution to stay in power as long as possible and to make this transition as difficult as possible for the opposition. So in a month's time, we're going to see the parliament convene. Then the president will appoint, most probably, a prime minister from PiS, and my guess is, and our guess is, that it's going to be Mateusz Morawiecki, who's going to have 2 weeks. So this will be the second half of November. He's going to have 2 weeks to build a coalition. He won't be able to do that, but he's going to, sit around, fiddle with his phone, and pretend he's calling the other coalition partners. And then finally, in early December, my guess is that we're going to see a Donald Tusk-led government. I mean, there's a number of scenarios we can imagine, but I think that at the end of the day, the most basic and the most simple scenario is gonna happen. We're gonna see coalition talks, which are gonna be very difficult, and there's gonna be a lot of twists and turns. But at the end of the day, I think that everybody on the opposition side knows and understands that they need to build a government because that's what the voters voted for. So basically, I think summing up, by early December, we're going to see a Donald Tusk government. And then that government will, first of all, have to pass a budget, because there's not much time to do that. And if they fail to do that, and this will be a budget prepared by Law and Justice, so if they don't do that, then the president will have an easy way to write up a new election. So this is something that just needs to happen. Basically, this budget needs to be voted on by the parliament. And then that's the moment when they're going to sit down and try to figure out what to do next. And you talk about threats. I think at this point we can talk about challenges, which probably are actually threats, but let's call them challenges. Well, one is obviously the economic situation. And we have energy prices, we have VAT on basic food products, which is going to go up at the beginning of the year. There's the prices of fuel that will go up. So there's going to be a number of things that will happen that will also most probably speed up inflation. So the economic situation isn't going to be very good. There's going to be an attempt to take over institutions, and there's very many institutions to be taken over. Basically, a number of people that just need to be fired for a number of reasons, and they're going to have to find new people to take these jobs. So basically, we're going to have to rebuild a civil service that for the last 8 years has been decimated. So that's also not an easy task. And then we're going to have to figure out what's going on in the world and with the geopolitical situation with Ukraine. On our borders, with Slovakia, with the Czech Republic, what's happening in the Middle East. So, and that's like I don't know, the first month of basically. So we haven't even gotten to February, and ahead of us, there's 2 elections. There's the local elections in April and the European elections in June, and that's also not an easy moment to start on your path with a 4-headed coalition, with all these partners having different divergent interests, because everybody will also want to get as many votes in these 2 next elections. And finally, there's going to be the president who's probably not going to be willing to play ball. And there's the president, there's public media, there's the constitutional tribunal, there's the judiciary. So having said that, we haven't even gotten to rule of law, and that's only the first 6 months. So lots of challenges here, and I have to say that even though when I was looking at Donald Tusk on Sunday, he looked very happy. But when I was thinking about this today, I don't really envy him, because I think he has a huge task ahead of him, and a very difficult task.
Yeah, thanks, Sanjay. And from what you have said, I understand that the foreign European policy, you haven't mentioned these challenges at all, actually. I mean, apart from the war in Ukraine, but there is quite a high probability that the government will be very much preoccupied with the domestic political situation, not have much time for European foreign policy reorientation, but this will certainly happen. And now it's time for us to try to understand what can happen and what should happen. And Daniela, I think this is quite clear that this new government will have a much more pro-European stance, that it will talk differently about the EU than the previous government, that it won't instrumentalize the EU and foreign policy for domestic political purposes. I think this is probably what we can expect. But will it be enough, in your opinion, to rebuild Poland's position in the European Union? And if you look at the EU agenda and what is ahead of us, where are the areas where Poland could constructively contribute to the European decision-making process and to solving these challenges which lie ahead of us?
Thank you, Piotr. Thanks a lot for having me on this panel today. So I think it is enormously great news to have Poland with that election result. I hear, the time frame and the difficulties in building the government and so on. And yes, the EU needs to be a little patient, and the German government needs to be a little patient in its wish to remend German-Polish relations, which I think are crucial to really rebuild. The European agenda is packed, and the first big, maybe point where the new Polish government comes in will be the December summit. If the time frame is, as you said, that might just as well work out. That will be a EU summit where key decisions on enlargement will be made, and at least in some way, a political direction needs to be taken how the EU thinks about its own reform before it can enlarge. So there's careful balance that needs to be struck between getting the EU enlargement ready and sending a positive signal to the candidate countries that the EU is serious and that we should move ahead for all the good reasons we have. I think that is a moment where Poland, of course, is an essential player, given Poland's role in the war, in supporting Ukraine, in the refugee policy that Poland for some time, put up so openly vis-a-vis Ukrainians. I think there's a lot to listen to and to learn from Polish experience. And the EU member states, I think, have a keen interest to also look at the grievances that Poland may have with regards to the enlargement agenda and the institutional reform agenda. I think that's, maybe my bottom line at this point, where it's very early days, looking ahead in a positive way, but also saying not everything that we have seen happening in Poland in terms of EU critical rhetoric, anti-German sentiment, and all these things, not all of that will go away, quite naturally not, because some of that are real grievances, some of that are by now deeply spread stories about the neighbor, which Germany is. And I think overcoming this on the one hand, but also working on really developing a joint perspective forward, that is key. And I do believe, despite the difficulties, Andre, which you have pointed out, we have a unique chance. And one of the topics which I would like to point out was last on your list. You said we haven't even spoken about the rule of law. And I think from an EU perspective, this is one of the major reasons why the electoral results are seen with such an optimism and hope to go forward. because the EU has not been able to protect rule of law within its borders sufficiently. And now, with the perspective of enlarging the European Union, the question how we can do better is key on the European political agenda. And if Poland switches sides and becomes one of the countries that within the EU can actually, maybe even learning from its own experience, play a role in taking forward the reflection, how can we do better to make sure we respect our own principles that every single member state signed on to? I think that is very important. And so, yes, I'm very much on the hopeful side, but I do see to what extent we have to be patient and to what extent we have to learn to listen to each other again.
Yeah, thank you, Daniela. And Daniela has already mentioned the Polish-German relationship, which you, Timothy, have followed for a very long time. And it is fair to say that this relationship is in a deep crisis, and the mutual trust is at a historical low. And at the same time, many observers, Ivan Klaster, for example, saying this is the key relationship in the European Union. This is of key importance for the future of the bloc. So Daniela also said that the change of the government will not make all the interest conflicts or grievances disappear. So my question for you, Timothy, is what should basically both sides do in order to rebuild, or I don't know, actually perhaps it's not the right word, to build a new partnership? Because there is this criticism in Poland that, we have been looked down by Germany for a very long time, that not treated as equal partners. I think that's very widespread. So is it possible to have an eye-to-eye conversation between Poland and Germany and a new partnership, and what would it take to build it?
I mean, one of the miracles of the post-89 period was how good Polish-German relations were for so long. Mm-hmm. Because if you just thought about the history, you'd have expected them to be bad and German-Czech relations to be rather good. And in fact, German-Czech relations are very difficult, and German-Polish. So there was something extraordinary there, which of course has, I'm not going to say gone wrong, been made wrong over the last 8 years. Some people here or listening may not have had the extraordinary pleasure of watching TVP, the Polish state television, but I do occasionally at considerable danger to my health. And I cannot convey to you just how relentless and crude and mendacious the anti-German propaganda is. And I'm afraid that Daniela is right, that this has reawakened resentments which had largely disappeared in Polish society. So that I think there's a task here in Poland to try and address those resentments and explain, and starting with, of course, reforming state TV. In terms of policy, I wouldn't say the crucial relationship is Poland-Germany. I would say it's France-Germany-Poland. Mm-hmm. It's the old Weimar Triangle. And we have the really new situation. One of the big things that's happened in Europe in the last year, that France, which was traditionally very reluctant to support eastward enlargement, particularly the EU, has suddenly changed its position quite fundamentally, strategically. So you have a strategic commitment from Emmanuel Macron to eastward enlargement of both EU and NATO. You have that commitment from Germany. You obviously have it from Poland. So I think the way forward is not so much, I mean, obviously you need to do things specifically Polish-German, but trying to make that Weimar Triangle, an avant-garde, if you like, the leading coalition of the willing inside the EU on the agenda of enlargement and reform, widening and deepening, the double agenda. My concern is, and I'd love to hear Andrzej on this, that I think they're going to be up against even more radical criticism from the right, not just from Confederacja, however badly it did, but I'd love to hear you on this, but also peace. I think it'll become more radical in its Euroscepticism. And of course, the anti-Ukrainian sentiments, which we heard a bit in the election campaign. And if the agenda is incremental enlargement, a bit more market access here, a bit more market access there for Ukraine, then the closer you come to that incremental enlargement, the more difficult it actually becomes for various parts of Polish society. So I think there'll be significant difficulties domestically in taking forward that strategy.
Yeah, thank you, Timothy. And Daniela, back to you on perhaps also on Germany, if I may, because I think there is indeed an expectation in Poland that this relationship improves, but many observers do not see only Poland as a country which needs to change its approach. That that Germany is also, expected to show more interest, perhaps in Poland, more equal treatment of the Polish partner, and also the readiness to accept that Poland can have divergent interests on many issues. Do you think that Germany is ready for that?
I do think so. And I do know how big the concern was that the bilateral relationship reached the degree we saw over the past, let's say, 2-3 years, and in particular during the election campaign. And what I heard very often in Berlin is we will try not to comment, we'll try and keep silent, we will bear this. But if we go back just 2 weeks back in time, the Warsaw Security Forum, we saw on stage how German-Polish relations over Ukraine, the sudden change of policy here on Ukraine, how this actually surfaces. And so I think there is a huge awareness how important the relationship is. I do see an opening for a Weimar Triangle relaunch, although I think all bilateral relationships in a way in that triangle at this moment need some mending. So it can be a collective exercise, but it also has to happen in bilateral relations. And with regards to your point, is Germany ready to accept divergent interests? I think, of course, but as long as there's a constructive base from which we can work. And I think this is now a big chance. And we can also, we can look at the divergent interests, and there will be quite many. But we can also look at what Poland used to be from a German perspective and how we can re-establish that joint agenda. And I remember very well when the UK left the European Union, Germany was looking around and asking, so who is our partner on single market issues, for instance? Because that has traditionally been a German-British agenda, like pushing deeper integration of the single market. And of course, Warsaw was very much being looked towards. And the question was raised, what can we do with the then also peace government? And there were attempts to have that kind of dialogue and to find a common ground. And there was a certain impulse coming from Poland. So I think there is now a real chance to find in the area of economics. I would also say in the area of European neighborhood, East, I mean, there are so many things to be discussed right now beyond enlargement policy, but also within how we design enlargement policy, how do we get this going. I do believe the whole question of Ukraine reconstruction is big, although it's early days, of course, as the war is still ongoing, but I would expect, and I'm happy to be corrected, but I do think that from a Polish perspective, this is also an essential question. And as we know, a lot of money will be moved to Ukraine through different channels than the EU budget for reconstruction. I think there's a real chance to look at the question, how much will Ukraine's accession to the EU, if it happens, cost when? And how do you compensate what this means in terms of loss for some countries more than for others? So there's the question of market access, of course, and you mentioned that, Timothy, staggered access. Yes, there will be countries or segments of society that will feel they are losers in that process within the EU 27. And it's extremely important, in my view, that we think about compensating losers of the accession process, both in the candidate countries, but also in the current EU member states, in a very, very careful way, because the political and socio-economic situation is fragile. And if we rush it, and if we don't think about that, we may see an erosion of political stability that goes further than we would have seen now. But, I think the first phase that we have to go through in German, Polish, in the trilateral relations, but also in the EU as a whole, is really to get a joint understanding of the depth of challenges we are facing. And I do believe that Russia's war in Ukraine and other drivers of geopolitical change will bring us all to a point where we understand that we are better off if we handle those challenges together than if we decide to all sit in our own corner and point our finger to the others.
I will ask Andrzej how, in a second, how he sees these expectations towards Poland. Are they exaggerated? Are they legitimate? But before I come to that, just a question to both of you, Timothy and Daniela, about the balance of power within the European Union and how it could change because of the outcome of the Polish election. I mean, on one hand, in the European Council, what that could mean for Europe, and also when it comes to the party politics in the European Union ahead of the European election. Is it a new political dynamics unfolding, or is Poland basically an exception which confirms the rule that the populism is coming back? I don't know whom of you.
Daniela, you start, and then I'll follow.
Okay. So one thing doesn't change. That is that Poland, my expectation, will remain where it is on Russia. And I think that is very important because now we will have a key player, which Poland is, with a hard line on Russia, returning to, I hope, a solid rule of law situation within the country. And that will, in my view, make it a very strong and constructive player in the way the EU can handle one of its biggest geopolitical challenges at the moment. In terms of shifting power relationships, of course, Poland is on track to become a stronger military player, also a totally legitimate voice in the EU's joint assessment and also with the NATO on the risk that Russia represents. And I think that is one of the points where, Polish criticism of Germany and its policy towards Russia over the past years is being taken very seriously in Germany, and with a self-correction that we went through since Russia started the full-scale invasion of Ukraine on 24th of February 2022, a lot has happened here. So there is, in fact, I guess, a new base. In terms of political leadership, thinking about the triangle, that would be very good because each of the three countries can bring and integrate positions of their friends and other countries that feel they are aligned. So I do believe there is a real new opening. I'm not someone who would easily say that since Russia attacked Ukraine, we have a real power shift towards the East. I don't see that, but I do see a huge commitment if you take the Baltic states, if you take Poland, not in absolute numbers, but in relative expenditure and support for Ukraine. That is a very, very clear commitment. But, the fact still is Germany is the largest economy in Europe. It is a Eurozone country, so is France. That is one of the key two differences to Poland. If it is true that the euro matters and that it's a more deeply economically and financially integrated area in the EU 27, the 20 states that share the currency, that doesn't change, right? And that is a very interesting conversation to be had. And I already said that Poland is a key partner from a German perspective on single market issues. There's a lot to move there as well, and Germany has to move on some of its traditional protective positions in that regard. So, I think there can be positive dynamics.
Can I follow directly on that? Because I very much agree with Daniela that there's a lot of journalistic talk about the center of the EU moving eastwards, as if it's somehow going to end up in Vilnius or something. It is vastly overdone. Germany is Europe's central power. You mentioned the importance of the Eurozone. If anything, it's moving more to Berlin. It's not moving to Warsaw or Vilnius. Point number two, I mean, the biggest driver, it seems to me, of what's going to happen in European politics over the next year or so, looking forward to the European elections, is not what's happened in Poland. It's mass migration. I mean, migration is the top issue, and that's what's driving our politics, together with the state of the economy, rather sharply to the right, so that actually, in a way, Poland is going against the trend. And I think there's a real danger that actually the hard right and populists will do very well in the European elections, nobody knows, and pull the whole EU to the right. Final point, while Poland has been going so spectacularly and encouragingly in the right direction, Viktor Orban has been going even more in the wrong. It is not just that Hungary actually is no longer a democracy. I would insist on that. It's not an illiberal democracy, it's an electoral authoritarian regime in a full member state of the EU, but he's off to meet Vladimir Putin in Beijing. And I just pose the question whether Article 7, which as all of you know, would mean that Hungary would potentially be suspended from EU decision-making for a time, which was off the table because PiS would veto for Fidesz and Fidesz would veto for PiS, might at least potentially come back onto the table. I think it would be a very good thing if we at least had a discussion about it.
Thank you, Timothy and Andrzej. Back to you. What do you make out of it? Is it we heard quite a lot about quite high expectations towards Poland after these elections and in relation with this political change happening in the country, and I'm just wondering to what extent the new government will be able to meet these expectations and or perhaps disappoint them. And Timothy also mentioned this state of the Polish public debate, and I'm also quite concerned that with the two right-wing parties in the opposition, Europe will move into the center of the Polish polarization, and that it will become a subject to a very polarized, very difficult debate ahead of the EP election and later on, and that we will have a very controversial debate about Europe, and I'm wondering how, if you agree with this picture, how this could influence Poland's also European policy.
I don't know where to start, actually, to answer your question. I was thinking, maybe I'll take a step back. I was thinking when you were talking about Poland being a champion of rule of law, that sounds very attractive and it sounds like a great idea. But I think we need to figure out our rule of law issues internally. And from what I'm hearing, and we're 3 days after the election, it's not going to be easy. I mean, even now, there's different people and different milieus trying to get to Donald Tusk and to tell them what to do. And already the bickering has started. And there's going to be a huge debate whether how should we figure this out? Should we stay within the borders of the limits of the law, or should we maybe look for some gray areas to do this faster? So I think that's the first question. How will we figure this out? And if we figure it out well, then quite obviously that would be a great role to play in the EU. But I think it's way too early to even hope for that at this point. Looking at the Polish-German relationship, there's one more thing. I think everything is very political and this conversation is political. I think we need to look towards business interests. I think one of the things that have not been exploited and actually still work after these 8 years is Polish-German business relations. But I think we need to rethink these because basically, because of the fact, and this is natural and this is obvious, that Germany was an investor in Poland, there's a lack of symmetry in these relations. And I think that if we were able to try and realign these interests, and reconstructing Ukraine could be one of these things, but also looking at how to rebuild the single markets and how to look for common interests and how to maybe look for a more partner relation between the two business communities, that could be one of the ideas of going forward. So basically, taking politics out of it, but also using business interests as a driver towards better Polish-German relations. But that's, coming back to your question, Piotr, it's going to be super difficult. I mean, for me, it's quite obvious it's going to be super difficult because, well, to start off, at least 7.6 million of Poles think that Donald Tusk is either a German or a Russian agent or both. And that doesn't really help you, especially with two elections ahead of you. You have PiS, you have Konfederacja, and I strongly agree with Professor Ash. I think that basically, and with what you said, that our future polarization is going to be around Europe. Our first polarization was about solidarity and communism. Then it was basically about transformation. And the third polarization, so I think, well, maybe not the third wave of solidarity, but the third wave polarization in this country is going to be around Europe. And that is going to be a very difficult conversation because at this point, especially with this campaign, Donald Tusk, in order to do whatever it takes to beat peace, started talking about migration, about energy policy, in ways that sound better to the right-wing electorate, and because of the propaganda and because of the atmosphere of the campaign. So now, if suddenly he reverses this rhetoric, that's not going to help him politically. And as I said, we have two elections, and then we have the presidential election 2025, which could actually, at the end of the day, be the most important election because that will be a safeguard before the next parliamentary election. I'm sorry to be mixing these elections, but I think they're all important, and they also will have a stake in what our European policy will be like. So I think that basically what I'm trying to say is that we're going to really have to take things one step at a time. And I think that it's going to take a lot of time to reverse peace policies, and it's not going to happen with the change of a foreign minister, with the change of a European minister, even with a change of mindset. The problem is that we need to change the way people are thinking about these issues, and also to be aware of the fact that most probably at some point, and my guess is that this will happen before the European elections, somebody is going to say the R word. And be it Konfederacja, be it Suwerenna Polska, one of these politicians will understand that bringing up the idea of a European referendum in Poland will give him 10% of the vote. And still, that's a long way away from a referendum. But that's a very dangerous step in the wrong direction when it comes to Polish European membership. So I don't know how this will play out on all these issues, and probably we could, we could organize a 2-day seminar about this. But basically, what I'm trying to say is that it's not going to be easy, and that the powers that be, Donald Tusk, and his coalition partners will really have to tread very softly because it's not only about politics, it's about a sentiment in society and a change that's coming and that most people aren't aware of. I think that people still believe here and abroad that we're a super pro-European country because we are. But these things change, and I think they're going to change faster than we anticipate.
Yeah, I think you should stop now because we started with a very kind of optimistic outlook and euphoric tone, and now we are drifting towards pessimism. But this is, I think, a good moment to perhaps change a little bit the dynamics and give you a chance here in Warsaw, but also on Zoom, to ask questions if there are any. I would be happy to take them. Please give me a sign if anybody wants to.
Katia Andrusz.
There is.
Katia Andrusz.
Yes. Okay. Please go ahead. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Katya Andrews. I'm spokesperson for the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. I wanted to ask Timothy, with so many years of experience in the region, do you think that there are takeaways, there are things that countries further east could or should be learning from the backsliding and foresliding on democracy here in Central Eastern Europe that we should be looking to further down the road?
Terrific question. And the answer is yes, I think they should be studying this success very closely. I mean, one obvious conclusion is the EU's not going to do it for you. It's up to you, right? I mean, as you rightly said, the EU is actually very, and Piotr has done great work on this, very ineffective in imposing conditionality. I mean, it'd be interesting to ask Andrzej if the question of the EU funds withheld, what role that played in the election. It was mentioned sometimes, but I would say on the whole, it's up to you. Point number two, the conventional wisdom has been, if you're facing a populist strongman, it's normally a man, in an unfair election, what you really need is a united opposition. So we have this great discussion here about can we get to a united opposition? Now, it's really interesting. Hungary last year, you had a united opposition. They lost. Turkey earlier this year, you had a united opposition. They lost. Poland on Sunday, you didn't have a united opposition, and they won. And there's an interesting question about whether it actually may be better in the end that you maximize the democratic opposition electorate by spreading it between a number of options.
Thank you. We have a question here, and there's also one in the chat, so I will read it in a second, but please go ahead.
Hi, Justyna Pawlak from Reuters, actually. I have a follow-up to Katya's question. If we're going to look in the other direction, if governments or parties or politicians in Western European countries were going to look at this election, what would be the takeaways for them in terms of how to combat kind of hard-right populists in their countries? What is it that this election tells them about how do you win or how do you push back against hard-right populists?
Who of you would like to take it? Timothy.
Okay, let me start. I wouldn't immediately see a direct read across because I don't think the problem is the same. The problem we have in most West European democracies is that, particularly because of the issue of migration, now sometimes mixed up with integration, terrorism, voters are going across to the populist xenophobic hard right, and the cordon sanitaire that was so important between center-right and hard-right is breaking down. Even in Germany, I mean, you know, where you have the ultimate taboo, which is Adolf Hitler, and you're just beginning to see the cordon sanitaire fray, as the AfD does so well. So I think for me, there's a different set of lessons, which is about what the liberal conservative or center-right does and does not do.
Thank you. So, Andrzej.
Yeah, also to Katya's question, I feel a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work, and obviously there will be lessons, but I wouldn't overestimate them. I feel that if you look at the result of this election, I don't know how much of this was the doing of the opposition, how much of this was the doing of the government. So I think that if I were looking for lessons, and I'm saying this ironically, but I'd look for, you know, to Kaczynski's mistakes if I were Orban and try not to repeat them. And I mean, even the referendum was a mistake and was taken out of Orban's playbook, but it played in the wrong direction because, and it's also about, you know, civil sentiment. And I feel that here, basically, the things that worked in other places didn't work for a number of reasons, also historic, etc. So what I'm trying to say is that you can always look for lessons, and I think there's tidbits that you can find, but I think the grand narrative is going to be different in different places, and I wouldn't overestimate the opposition here, I'd rather look towards the mistakes of the government. Sorry to say that.
Daniela, there is a question from the chat on the EU elections and Polish Council presidency. What kind of stimulus the Polish Council presidency could give to the EU after the EU elections, and also in view of the Conservatives perhaps gaining seats in the European Parliament, so that basically there is a expectation that there would be this populist wave going through. And how would you see, this in the context of perhaps a liberal Polish government running the EU 2025 in the first half?
Yeah. So first on the European elections, and this goes back to the debate which we just had, what can we learn from Poland? I think the question that is really worthwhile studying is how the youth mobilization worked for this election with a huge turnout and a pro-European vote. It's a question for Poland, how can this be replicated in the European elections? But beyond that, because there is a fear, as it was 2 elections ago, that the EU could turn, or even 1 election ago, that the EU Parliament could turn more heavily impacted by the far right, what can we learn about the way to position EU issues, the way to give young people the impression they can actually have an impact on where this is going? So I think that is of huge importance, and we don't have that much time, right? Because it's essentially 6-7 months to go. The Polish EU presidency, I think, now I'm much less worried than I was before last Sunday about this fact, because having 2 EU presidencies, Hungary and Poland, in a relatively short time span, both in violation of Article 7, is an issue, would have been an issue for the EU. So I think the Polish government coming into that role will, like any other government, only have 6 months to go and an agenda packed anyway with a lot of issues that are ongoing, but will be able to put and introduce its own emphasis. And that is one which serves internal communication. As all EU presidencies do, they think about how can we use our time to communicate about Europe at home, and what are the topics we can bring. And, looking ahead, I do think that the whole issue of European security order, Ukraine, that will be key. Migration, by that time, I hope the EU will have agreed on a framework that takes some pressure out of the issue, although the migration flows, in my view, will increase over that period. But to get this politically settled in a way that is acceptable, I hope happens before the presidency of Poland. And then other issues where I do think we will have a lot to discuss over the next 1, 2, 3 years is really the way the European economic model changes. And here I'm very much with Andrzej, who spoke about economic relationships, bringing other stakeholders in your case, the corporate sector. I think that is of key importance to think through Poland being a big and successful economy in the European Union. If you look at its development since it became an EU member, is that maybe an agenda that the Polish EU presidency may want to push? And as I said before, it is a topic that is important for Germany, and Germany is one of the countries which has been pretty stubborn on some of the last things we need to do to really complete the single market. So, an impulse would be helpful for the EU.
But interestingly, the priorities which have been so far defined mostly by the president for the Polish EU presidency, they are transatlantic relationship, energy security, and enlargement. Very general, actually not covering the questions you mentioned. It will be interesting to see to what extent the Polish government, the new government, will redefine these priorities. Also in view of the fact that according to a new law which we have in Poland, the current president simply in Poland, will have much more say on foreign and European policy, and the government is obliged to coordinate its positions with the president, and the president could even request his right to participate in the European summits, which will make for yet another complication, I think, for this government, adding to what Andrzej already explained. But we have, I think, a chance to take up very last, very brief question and give very short answer.
It's working? Yes.
Yeah.
Hello, Thomas Behrens from Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Warsaw. You all mentioned the possible importance of the Weimar Triangle as a format, but many people are referring these days to this project. And do you see there any key project which could be taken now as a restart for this format? And in addition to this, concerning Ukraine, do you think to include Ukraine could be a possible step for this format, or is this too ambitious?
I can just say it's too ambitious.
The answer is yes. I think, above all, what I'm missing from Berlin, and quite specifically from the Chancellery, is a more strategic approach to the question of widening and deepening, putting those two things together. You know, in the history of the Federal Republic, you've had three big national strategies, each of which have had major European implications. So you had the Western integration by Konrad Adenauer, Ostpolitik Willy Brandt, and then Helmut Kohl's combination of German and European unification. So roughly every 20 years, you get a big German initiative which has major European implications. So it's time for another one. And what I want to see is what I call Gesamteuropapolitik, which is precisely that combination of thinking, enlargement, and what you're going to do to reform the EU together. So that, for me, and because of Macron's quite remarkable shift on this issue, you actually have a possibility that you didn't have before to do this à trois. So I'd plead for a little ambition.
Thank you very much. And there is, Andrzej certainly have a 2 seconds answer to the question from the chat, how to relaunch the Polish-Ukrainian relationship. No, he hasn't. I think we will have to organize another debate to discuss these issues, and there are many other questions in the chat and certainly also here in the room, but our time is up. And I think, you know, how to sum it up, I don't dare to do that. I think there is understandable optimism with regard to the outcome of the election, but lots of open questions still. And I think this kind of a little bit downbeat tone of some of the comments, I think it's legitimate and it should be taken seriously. So Poland is on a very good track, I think, after this election, and especially when it comes to European foreign policy. But it will require some patience from Poland's partners, and it will also take quite a lot of time to complete all these reform projects which are already on the agenda, and to start thinking strategically about European and foreign policy. So thanks a lot, Daniela Schwarzer, Timothy Gartonash, Andrzej Bobinski. Thank you, Polityka Insight, for co-hosting, or actually hosting this event co-organized jointly with European Council on Foreign Relations. I think I didn't introduce myself at the beginning, so I
So who are you?
say it at the very end. My name is Piotr Buras. I'm head of the Warsaw office of the European Council on Foreign Relations. And thank you very much for being with us here in Warsaw, and thank you all who join us via Zoom. Thank you. Bye-bye.